The October evening in 1993 carried that particular chill that settles over Tulsa County just as autumn begins to bite. Donna Hughes pulled her denim jacket tighter around her shoulders as she stepped out of her ground-floor apartment on Maple Street, the familiar creak of the screen door marking what would be her final exit from the modest duplex she'd called home for 8 months. At 24, Donna possessed the kind of easy confidence that came from growing up in Oklahoma's heartland, where neighbors knew each other's routines and a 6-block walk to visit a friend felt as safe as crossing your own backyard. The streetlights had just flickered on, casting long shadows between the oak trees that lined the residential street. Donna's sneakers made soft sounds against the cracked sidewalk as she walked past the collection of small homes and duplexes that made up this quiet corner of the county. She'd made this same walk dozens of times before, usually on Friday evenings when she and Sophie Gutierrez would settle in for their weekly ritual of rented movies and homemade popcorn. Tonight felt no different from any other, except for the slight urgency in her step. Sophie had called earlier, her voice carrying that particular excitement that meant she had news to share. Donna passed the Kowalski house with its perpetually barking terrier, then the vacant lot where kids had worn a path through the tall grass, playing shortcuts to the corner store. Her purse, a small brown leather bag her mother had given her for her 23rd birthday, bounced lightly against her hip as she walked. Inside were the usual items that filled a young woman's life: her driver's license, $23 in crumpled bills, a tube of cherry lip balm, her apartment key attached to a small stuffed elephant keychain, and a folded piece of paper with Sophie's new phone number, written in her own careful handwriting. The last person to see Donna Hughes alive was 71-year-old Frank Sullivan, who had spent the better part of 4 decades watching the neighborhood change from his front porch. Frank was settling into his evening routine, newspaper folded beside his chair, when he spotted Donna's familiar figure passing under the streetlight at the corner of Maple and Oak. Something made him lift his hand in greeting. Perhaps it was the purposeful way she moved, or simply the ingrained politeness of a man who'd grown up when neighbors acknowledged each other. Donna saw him and returned the wave, her smile visible even in the amber glow of the streetlight. Frank would later tell investigators that she looked happy, unhurried, completely at ease as she disappeared around the corner toward Elm Street. What Frank couldn't have known as he watched her recede into the darkness was that this moment, frozen at exactly 7:42 p.m., according to the kitchen clock he'd glanced at just moments before, would haunt him for the rest of his life. The wave, the smile, the complete normalcy of a young woman simply walking to see a friend, all of it would be dissected and analyzed, remembered and re-remembered, until Frank began to question every detail of those final seconds. If you've ever wondered how quickly an ordinary evening can transform into something that changes an entire community forever, the answers often lie in these mundane moments that seem insignificant until they become everything. Subscribe now, because what happened next would leave investigators baffled and a family destroyed, in ways that no one that October evening could have possibly imagined. Donna Hughes never reached Sophie Gutierrez's house. Somewhere in those 6 blocks, in a neighborhood where the most serious crime in recent memory had been kids vandalizing the high school gymnasium, a 24-year-old woman simply vanished. The distance between Frank Sullivan's wave and Sophie's front door became a chasm that would swallow not just Donna, but the peace of mind of everyone who thought they understood how safe their small corner of the world really was. Sophie Gutierrez checked her watch for the 4th time in 10 minutes, the digital display glowing 8:47 p.m. in the darkened living room. She'd kept the curtains open, watching for the familiar sight of Donna's figure turning up the walkway, but the street remained empty except for the occasional car passing under the streetlights. This wasn't like Donna. Punctuality was one of her most reliable traits, a habit ingrained from years of opening shifts at the diner where she worked. When Donna said she'd be there by 8, she meant 7:55. By 9:15, concern had crystallized into genuine worry. Sophie dialed Donna's apartment, letting the phone ring 15 times before hanging up. She tried again 10 minutes later with the same result. The silence on the other end felt different from simply not being home. It carried weight, an absence that seemed to press against Sophie's chest as she stood in her kitchen, receiver in hand. When she finally called the Tulsa County Sheriff's Office at 9:43 p.m., her voice carried the apologetic tone of someone who hoped she was overreacting. Deputy Ray Carson took the call with the patient professionalism of a man who'd fielded hundreds of similar reports over his 12-year career. Most missing person calls involving young adults resolved themselves within hours. A change of plans, a spontaneous detour, a simple miscommunication. But something in Sophie's voice, a tremor beneath her careful recounting of the facts, made him reach for his jacket instead of simply filling out a standard report. Carson arrived at Donna's apartment at 10:21 p.m., his patrol car's headlights sweeping across the small parking area behind the duplex. Donna's aging Honda Civic sat in its usual spot, keys nowhere to be found despite Carson's thorough check of the obvious hiding places. The apartment itself told the story of someone who'd left expecting to return, dishes in the sink, a half-finished crossword puzzle on the coffee table, the television still tuned to the evening news. Her bed was unmade, but not in a way that suggested struggle, more like someone had simply gotten up and started their day. The search began in earnest at first light, though calling it a search overstated the resources available to rural Tulsa County. Sheriff's deputies walked the 6-block route between Donna's apartment and Sophie's house, questioning every resident who answered their doors. Frank Sullivan's account of waving to Donna became the last confirmed sighting, a timestamp that investigators would return to repeatedly in the days that followed. The elderly man sat on his front porch, pointing toward the corner where he'd last seen her, his weathered hands trembling slightly as he described the complete normalcy of the moment. What shattered that normalcy came on the second day of searching. Deputy Maria Gonzalez was walking a grid pattern through the drainage areas that bordered the residential neighborhood when she spotted something brown against the gray concrete of a culvert 2 miles from Donna's last known location. Donna's purse lay partially submerged in the shallow water that collected at the bottom of the ditch, its contents scattered in a way that immediately caught Gonzalez's attention. The scene made no sense to investigators. Donna's wallet remained intact, the $23 still folded inside alongside her driver's license and credit cards. Her lip balm had rolled several feet away, coming to rest against a cluster of dead leaves. The small stuffed elephant keychain that held her apartment key lay tangled in the tall grass at the culvert's edge, as if it had been thrown rather than dropped. But there were no signs of struggle at the location, no torn fabric or disturbed earth that might indicate violence. Detective Mike O'Brien crouched beside the drainage ditch as the county's lone crime scene photographer documented every angle of the discovery. 26 years of police work had taught him to read scenes like this, to understand the stories that physical evidence told about moments of crisis or violence. But Donna's scattered belongings told a story that made no sense, too random to be accidental, too careful to be the result of a struggle, too far from her intended route to be explained by any scenario that investigators could construct. The purse would be processed for fingerprints, though the water damage had likely destroyed most usable evidence. The contents would be catalogued and analyzed, each item scrutinized for clues that might explain how they'd ended up in a drainage ditch 2 miles from where Donna Hughes was last seen alive. But even as the investigation expanded, seasoned investigators already recognized the hallmarks of a case that would challenge every assumption they held about how people disappeared and why. Detective Mike O'Brien had worked enough missing person cases to recognize the pattern that was emerging around Donna Hughes's disappearance. The initial burst of activity, the methodical canvassing of witnesses, the careful examination of her personal life, all of it was yielding the kind of frustrating normalcy that made cases go cold. Donna Hughes, it seemed, had lived the sort of unremarkable life that offered investigators no obvious threads to pull, no dark corners to illuminate, no enemies to interrogate. The interviews began with Sophie Gutierrez, who sat across from O'Brien in the cramped conference room at the sheriff's office, her hands wrapped around a cup of coffee that had long since gone cold. Sophie's account never wavered through 3 separate sessions. Donna had called around 6:30 that evening, sounding excited about something she wanted to share, probably news about the promotion she'd been hoping for at the diner. They'd made plans to watch a rented movie, something light to unwind after a long week. Nothing in Sophie's description suggested anything unusual about Donna's mood or circumstances. O'Brien methodically worked through Donna's circle of acquaintances, a surprisingly small group for a 24-year-old woman. Her co-workers at Murphy's Diner painted a picture of reliability and quiet competence. Manager Patricia Collins described Donna as the employee she'd most want to open with, someone who arrived early and never called in sick. The regular customers knew her by name, appreciated her efficiency with their orders, but none recalled any uncomfortable interactions or unwanted attention. Even the diner's delivery driver, Tommy Rodriguez, who'd briefly dated Donna the previous spring, spoke of her with nothing but respect and genuine concern for her safety. The investigation into Donna's personal relationships revealed the kind of careful distance that characterized many young adults navigating life on their own. She spoke to her mother, Donna Hughes, every Sunday evening, conversations that Linda described as warm.
If you're a fan of mystery cases, don't forget to like and subscribe to our channel.
But not particularly revealing. Donna shared news about work, complained about her landlord's reluctance to fix the apartment's temperamental heating system, mentioned books she was reading or movies she'd enjoyed. But she rarely discussed her personal life in detail, and Linda had learned not to push for information that Donna seemed reluctant to share. Financial records painted an equally unremarkable picture. Donna's bank account showed the modest but steady pattern of someone living paycheck to paycheck without significant stress. Deposits from the diner arrived with clockwork regularity, withdrawals clustered around rent payments and grocery shopping. There were no large cash withdrawals, no unusual expenditures, no evidence of financial pressure that might have motivated her to disappear voluntarily. Her apartment lease was current, her car payments up to date, her credit card carrying a balance of less than $200. As weeks turned to months, O'Brien found himself returning repeatedly to the physical evidence, hoping that fresh eyes might reveal something previously overlooked. The scattered contents of Donna's purse had been processed multiple times, yielding only smudged fingerprints too degraded by water damage to provide useful comparisons. The location where the purse was discovered remained inexplicable, too far from Donna's route to suggest she'd been heading there willingly, too random to indicate planning or familiarity with the area. The handful of potential sightings that trickled in during the first few months all proved to be false leads. A convenience store clerk thought she'd seen Donna buying cigarettes 3 days after her disappearance, but security camera footage showed a woman 10 years older with significantly different features. A truck driver reported picking up a hitchhiker matching Donna's description on Interstate 44, but the woman he described was traveling with a small child, something that immediately ruled out any connection to the case. By the spring of 1994, the active investigation had effectively stalled. O'Brien's caseload had expanded to include 2 armed robberies and a domestic homicide that demanded immediate attention. The Donna Hughes file moved from his active cases to the growing stack of unsolved investigations that occupied the bottom drawer of his filing cabinet. The last entry in the case log, dated April 15, 1994, noted simply, "No new leads. Case suspended pending further information." It was the kind of bureaucratic language that made a young woman's disappearance sound like a temporarily misplaced document rather than a family's ongoing nightmare. Linda Hughes discovered that grief has its own geography, a landscape of anniversaries and reminders that transforms familiar territory into something foreign and painful. October evenings became particularly difficult, each one carrying the weight of that night in 1993, when her daughter had simply vanished from a 6-block walk that should have taken 12 minutes. Linda found herself driving those same streets repeatedly during the months after Donna's disappearance, as if her maternal instinct might detect something that trained investigators had missed. The first year was characterized by a desperate belief that answers were imminent. Linda called Detective O'Brien weekly, then monthly, always maintaining the careful politeness of someone who understood that persistence could easily be mistaken for pestering. She organized search parties that combed through wooded areas and abandoned buildings throughout Tulsa County, coordinating with local volunteer groups and churches, whose members showed up with thermoses of coffee and determination that gradually faded as searches yielded nothing but empty lots and discarded trash. When the first anniversary of Donna's disappearance arrived, Linda organized a vigil in the parking lot of Murphy's Diner, where Donna had worked and where many people in the community had known her. 17 people showed up, holding candles against the October wind and sharing memories of a young woman whose absence had become a permanent presence in their lives. Patricia Collins, the diner manager, spoke about Donna's reliability and kindness, her voice breaking as she described how the staff still sometimes set out an extra coffee cup during the morning rush, a habit they'd developed unconsciously and couldn't seem to break. As years passed, Linda developed what she privately called her Donna ritual. Every Sunday she visited the sheriff's office, not to demand updates but simply to remind whoever was on duty that Donna Hughes remained missing, that her case deserved continued attention. She learned the names of new deputies, the schedules of different shifts, the bureaucratic pathways that kept cases from being forgotten entirely. Linda became a familiar presence in the hallways, treated with the respectful sympathy reserved for those carrying impossible burdens with remarkable dignity. The scrapbook began as a way to organize newspaper clippings, but it evolved into something approaching obsession. Linda collected every mention of Donna's case, no matter how brief, pasting articles into a series of notebooks that eventually filled an entire bedroom closet. She included police reports when she could obtain them, photographs from search efforts, even handwritten notes from people who called with potential sightings. The scrapbooks became a kind of alternate investigation, Linda's attempt to maintain the momentum that official channels had gradually lost. Technology changed around Linda's vigil. The sheriff's office computerized their records, installed new phone systems, hired younger investigators who knew Donna's case only as a file number in a database. Linda adapted to each change, learning to navigate new procedures and establish relationships with personnel who viewed her daughter's disappearance as historical rather than urgent. She became expert at translating her concerns into the language that bureaucracies understood, framing her requests for information in terms that acknowledged resource limitations while never accepting that those limitations justified abandoning the search for answers. The hardest moments came during years when nothing happened at all, when months would pass without a single development or lead. Linda learned to recognize the difference between cases that remained active and those that had simply been forgotten, understanding that Donna's investigation fell somewhere in between, not officially closed, but not actively pursued either. She watched other families receive answers, saw cases resolved through new evidence or confessions, and struggled with the complex emotions that arose from witnessing other people's closure while her own questions remained unanswered. By the 15th anniversary of Donna's disappearance, Linda's annual vigil had become a community tradition, though attendance varied depending on weather and competing obligations. The faces changed as people moved away or lost touch with the case, but a core group of friends, neighbors, and Murphy's Diner employees continued to gather each October, maintaining their commitment to remembering a young woman whose absence had shaped their understanding of how quickly safety could vanish. Linda spoke at each vigil, her words carefully chosen to maintain hope while acknowledging the passage of time that made answers seem increasingly unlikely. What Linda couldn't have known during those 2 decades of persistence was that somewhere in Arkansas, a man named Luca Becker was serving a life sentence for murder, his DNA sitting in a database that would eventually be cross-referenced with evidence collected from a drainage ditch in Tulsa County 26 years earlier. Detective Jennifer Sanders inherited her father's methodical nature and her mother's stubborn refusal to accept injustice, qualities that made her uniquely suited for the kind of work that required sifting through decades of forgotten evidence with fresh eyes and infinite patience. When Tulsa County Sheriff's Office announced the formation of their first dedicated cold case unit in early 2019, Sanders was among 3 investigators selected for the assignment, chosen specifically because of her background in forensic technology and her reputation for persistence that bordered on obsession. The cold case unit occupied a windowless basement room in the county building, its walls lined with filing cabinets that contained the accumulated mysteries of 4 decades. Each cabinet represented lives interrupted, families shattered, questions that had outlasted the investigators who first asked them. Sanders approached the assignment with the systematic precision of an archaeologist, understanding that time had likely destroyed some evidence while simultaneously creating new opportunities for analysis that hadn't existed when these cases were fresh. The technology available to Sanders in 2019 would have seemed like science fiction to the investigators who had worked Donna Hughes's case in 1993. DNA analysis that once required samples the size of quarters could now yield results from microscopic traces of biological material. Database systems could cross-reference evidence across state lines and decades, identifying connections that manual filing systems had made impossible to detect. Most importantly, the combined DNA index system, CODIS, had grown from a promising pilot program to a comprehensive database containing millions of genetic profiles from offenders, crime scenes, and unidentified remains. Sanders's review of the Donna Hughes file began on a Tuesday morning in March, when she pulled the manila folder from a cabinet marked Unsolved 1990s. The physical evidence had been stored properly, sealed in paper bags that had yellowed with age, but preserved their contents in conditions suitable for modern analysis. The photographs, witness statements, and investigation logs told a story that Sanders recognized from dozens of similar cases, methodical police work stymied by the technological limitations of its era, and the simple absence of obvious suspects or motives. What caught Sanders's attention wasn't what the original investigators had found, but what they hadn't been able to analyze thoroughly. The degraded fingerprints from Donna's purse, dismissed in 1993 as too damaged for comparison, could now be enhanced through digital processing techniques that revealed details invisible to the naked eye. More importantly, the purse itself had never been tested for DNA evidence, a technique that was still emerging in 1993 and considered too expensive for routine use in cases without obvious biological evidence. The process of resubmitting evidence for modern analysis required navigating bureaucratic channels that had changed significantly since Donna's disappearance. Sanders spent weeks coordinating between the county's evidence storage facility, the state crime lab, and federal databases, ensuring that chain of custody procedures remained intact, while allowing for examinations that could potentially yield results that had been impossible to obtain 26 years earlier. While waiting for laboratory results, Sanders systematically reviewed every aspect of the original investigation, looking for connections or patterns that might have been overlooked. She mapped the locations mentioned in witness statements, cross-referenced known offenders who had lived in Tulsa County during 1993, and examined similar unsolved cases from the same time period. The work required the kind of patience that could only be sustained by someone who understood that cold cases weren't solved through dramatic breakthroughs, but through the accumulation of small details that eventually revealed larger truths. The systematic nature of the review meant that Sanders was examining multiple cases simultaneously, allowing her to identify connections that might span investigations that had never been linked previously. Pattern recognition software could now analyze crime scene characteristics, geographic clusters, and temporal relationships in ways that human investigators, working with paper files and limited communication systems, had been unable to accomplish in the 1990s. When the preliminary DNA results arrived from the state crime lab in late spring, they confirmed what Sanders had hoped for. Genetic material suitable for CODIS comparison had been successfully extracted from Donna's purse, material that had survived 26 years of storage and could now be compared against millions of profiles from across the country. The next phase of the investigation would depend entirely on whether Donna's attacker had ever been arrested for another crime, providing the genetic sample that would finally connect him to the young woman who had vanished during what should have been a routine walk to visit a friend. The CODIS hit notification arrived on a Thursday morning in June, appearing in Detective Sanders's email inbox with the bureaucratic efficiency that characterized most communications between law enforcement databases. The subject line read simply, DNA match, case reference 932847. But Sanders understood immediately that those few words represented the first significant breakthrough in Donna Hughes's case in more than 2 decades. The genetic profile extracted from Donna's purse had found its match in the federal database, connecting evidence from a 1993 disappearance to a convicted offender whose name had never appeared in the original investigation. Luca James Becker, Arkansas Department of Corrections inmate number 47291, had been serving a life sentence without parole since his conviction for first-degree murder in 2002. The victim in that case was a 31-year-old woman named Michelle Patterson, found strangled in her apartment in Little Rock after neighbors reported screaming and the sound of breaking glass. Becker's conviction had relied heavily on DNA evidence collected from Patterson's apartment, evidence that had automatically entered his genetic profile into CODIS upon his sentencing. Sanders spent the rest of that morning reviewing Becker's criminal history, a progression of increasingly serious offenses that painted the portrait of a man whose capacity for violence had escalated over time. His first arrest came in 1989 for assault, followed by charges for burglary, domestic violence, and sexual assault that had either been pled down or dismissed due to insufficient evidence. The pattern suggested someone who had learned to avoid detection while continuing to commit crimes, developing the kind of predatory sophistication that made him particularly dangerous. What made the connection to Donna Hughes's case even more significant was the timeline of Becker's movements. According to Arkansas Department of Corrections records, Becker had lived in Tulsa County from 1991 through early 1994, working at Patterson's Auto Repair on South Sheridan Road. The shop was located less than 3 blocks from Donna's apartment, close enough that Becker would have been familiar with the neighborhood where she lived and the routes she typically walked. Employment records showed that Becker had left Tulsa abruptly in February 1994, telling his supervisor only that he had family business to attend to in Arkansas. The investigation into Becker's time in Tulsa revealed a man who had maintained a deliberately low profile in the community. His landlord, reached after considerable effort, remembered him as a quiet tenant who paid rent on time but rarely engaged with neighbors or participated in any social activities. Co-workers at the auto shop described someone who possessed mechanical skills but seemed uncomfortable around other people, particularly women. Several mentioned that Becker would often volunteer for overtime shifts or weekend work, preferring solitude to the casual interactions that characterized most workplace relationships. Patterson's Auto Repair had closed in 1997, and the building now housed a convenience store, but Sanders managed to locate the former owner, James Patterson, who had vivid memories of his former employee. Patterson described Becker as competent but troubling, someone whose work was reliable, but whose behavior occasionally crossed boundaries that made customers and other employees uncomfortable. There had been complaints about Becker staring at female customers, lingering unnecessarily long when delivering completed repairs to women who came to pick up their vehicles alone. Most significantly, Patterson recalled that Becker had access to a company pickup truck during his employment, a dark blue Ford that employees could use for parts runs and service calls. The truck matched the description that Frank Sullivan's widow had provided during the case review. A strange man in a dark pickup parked near Maple Street on the evening of Donna's disappearance. The detail had seemed insignificant at the time, one of hundreds of observations that witnesses offered, but that led nowhere in the context of the original investigation. The bureaucratic process of coordinating between Oklahoma and Arkansas law enforcement agencies required weeks of careful documentation and formal requests. Sanders needed to establish not just the DNA connection, but also the circumstantial evidence that placed Becker in the right location, at the right time, with the means and opportunity to commit the crime. Each piece of evidence had to be verified and documented according to standards that would satisfy prosecutors who would eventually need to present the case to a jury. As Sanders compiled the growing file on Luca Becker, she began to understand how his crimes had been facilitated by the limited communication between law enforcement agencies in the 1990s. His arrests in different jurisdictions had never been connected, his pattern of behavior never recognized as part of a larger picture of predatory violence. The technology that had finally linked him to Donna Hughes's disappearance had also revealed how many opportunities for earlier intervention had been missed, how many victims might have been spared if the connections had been visible 25 years sooner. Detective Sanders understood that building a prosecutable case against Luca Becker would require more than DNA evidence linking him to Donna's purse. 26 years after the crime, she needed to reconstruct not just what had happened on that October evening in 1993, but how Becker's presence in the neighborhood could be established through witness testimony that had aged nearly 3 decades. The challenge lay in finding people whose memories remained reliable and whose recollections could withstand the scrutiny of a defense attorney determined to create reasonable doubt. The systematic review of the original witness statements revealed details that had seemed insignificant in 1993, but now carried potential importance in light of Becker's connection to the case. Sanders began the painstaking process of re-interviewing everyone who had provided statements during the initial investigation, understanding that many witnesses had moved away, passed away, or simply forgotten details that might have once seemed crystal clear. Each conversation required delicate handling, as Sanders needed to extract information without leading witnesses toward conclusions that might compromise the integrity of their testimony. Frank Sullivan had died in 2009, but his widow Margaret remained sharp and articulate at 87, living in the same house where she and Frank had witnessed the neighborhood's gradual transformation over 5 decades. Margaret's memory of that October evening had been preserved not through official police statements, which had focused primarily on Frank's account, but through the countless conversations she and Frank had shared about their last glimpse of Donna Hughes. Margaret remembered details that Frank had never mentioned to investigators, including her observation of an unfamiliar pickup truck parked at the corner of Maple and Oak Streets earlier that same day. The truck had caught Margaret's attention because it remained parked in the same location for several hours during the afternoon, something unusual in a neighborhood where most vehicles belonged to residents who followed predictable patterns. Margaret described the driver as a man who seemed to be watching the street rather than waiting for someone, his posture suggesting surveillance rather than casual observation.
If you're a fan of mystery cases, don't forget to like and subscribe to our channel.
When she mentioned this to Frank later that evening, he had dismissed her concern as the natural suspicion of someone who had lived through enough changes to be wary of anything that disrupted familiar routines. Sanders cross-referenced Margaret's description with employment records from Patterson's Auto Repair, confirming that Becker would have had access to the company's dark blue pickup truck during his work hours. More importantly, the repair shop's scheduling records, archived in boxes that had spent decades in storage, showed that October 22, 1993 had been a Friday, when Becker was scheduled to work until 5 p.m., but had left early, citing a family emergency that his supervisor couldn't verify and hadn't questioned at the time. The timeline reconstruction revealed a gap of nearly 3 hours between Becker's departure from work and the time when Donna Hughes was last seen alive. Those missing hours, which had seemed irrelevant in 1993, now represented the window during which Becker could have positioned himself in the neighborhood, observed Donna's routines, and planned the attack that would end her life. The methodical nature of the preparation suggested someone who understood the area well enough to know when streets would be empty and which routes offered the privacy necessary for violence. Additional witness interviews uncovered memories that had never been formally documented during the original investigation. Patricia Collins, who still worked at Murphy's Diner, though now as assistant manager rather than head of operations, recalled that Donna had mentioned being uncomfortable about someone who had been asking questions about her schedule. The conversation had occurred several weeks before Donna's disappearance, during a busy lunch shift when Patricia had been too distracted to pay close attention to details that now seemed potentially crucial. According to Patricia's recollection, Donna had described a customer who came into the diner multiple times but never seemed to eat much, instead spending his time watching the staff and asking personal questions that made everyone uncomfortable. The man had wanted to know when Donna worked, where she lived, whether she walked to work or drove. Patricia remembered that Donna had laughed off the attention as harmless but annoying, the kind of awkward social interaction that waitresses learn to navigate without making situations worse through direct confrontation. The physical evidence from Patterson's Auto Repair, long since discarded or lost to time, couldn't provide direct confirmation of Becker's movements on October 22, 1993. However, The systematic reconstruction of his work schedule, combined with witness accounts that had never been connected to the original investigation, began to create a coherent narrative of surveillance and planning that explained how a predator had identified his victim and chosen his moment to strike. The Arkansas State Penitentiary sits like a concrete monument to human failure in the flat landscape outside Pine Bluff, its guard towers and razor wire creating a perimeter that seems designed as much to contain despair as to prevent escape. Detective Sanders made the 4-hour drive from Tulsa on a humid August morning, carrying with her a carefully prepared interview strategy and 26 years of questions that finally had a target. Luca Becker had agreed to the interview through his attorney, a decision that puzzled seasoned investigators who understood that guilty men rarely volunteer to discuss their crimes with police officers they've never met. The interview room was exactly what Sanders had expected from her experience with correctional facilities: fluorescent lighting that cast everything in harsh shadows, a metal table bolted to the floor, chairs that had been designed for discomfort rather than extended conversation. Becker entered wearing the standard-issue jumpsuit that had been his uniform for nearly 2 decades, his appearance altered by years of institutional life, but still recognizable from the booking photos that had been taken after his conviction for Michelle Patterson's murder. At 57, Becker carried himself with the careful posture of someone who had learned to navigate prison hierarchies through calculated restraint rather than aggression. His hair had gone completely gray, and the institutional diet had left him thinner than in his earlier photographs, but his eyes retained the predatory alertness that several witnesses had described during his trial in Arkansas. Sanders recognized the type immediately, intelligent enough to understand the gravity of his situation, experienced enough with the criminal justice system to know that every word he spoke would be analyzed and potentially used against him. The opening phase of the interview followed protocols that Sanders had refined through hundreds of similar conversations. She established rapport through neutral topics, acknowledged Becker's cooperation in agreeing to meet with her, and gradually introduced the circumstances that had brought her to Arkansas. Throughout these preliminary exchanges, Sanders observed Becker's micro-expressions and body language, looking for tells that might indicate when he was being truthful and when he was constructing careful deceptions. Becker's initial responses followed predictable patterns of denial and misdirection. He claimed no memory of living in Tulsa County during the 1990s, then acknowledged his employment at Patterson's Auto Repair. When confronted with documentation that made continued denial impossible, he insisted that he had never known Donna Hughes, had never visited Murphy's Diner, had no recollection of the neighborhood where she lived. Each denial was delivered with the practiced sincerity of someone who had spent decades refining his ability to lie convincingly. The turning point came when Sanders presented the DNA evidence that had connected Becker to Donna's purse. The scientific certainty of genetic matching allowed no room for the kind of alternative explanations that had characterized his earlier responses. Sanders watched as Becker's carefully constructed defenses began to crumble, his posture shifting from defensive confidence to the resignation of someone who understood that decades of successful deception were finally ending. The psychological dynamics of confession involve complex negotiations between the suspect's desire to maintain control and his growing awareness that the evidence makes continued denial impossible. Sanders had studied these patterns extensively, understanding that the moment when a perpetrator decides to tell the truth often occurs not through dramatic confrontation, but through the gradual erosion of hope that lies might still provide protection. Becker's transformation followed this familiar pattern, his body language shifting from rigid denial to something approaching relief. When Becker finally began to speak about October 22, 1993, his voice carried the flat affect of someone recounting events that he had spent 26 years trying to forget. The details emerged slowly, with Sanders careful not to interrupt or prompt responses that might later be challenged as coercive. Becker described his obsession with Donna Hughes, his systematic observation of her routines, his growing fantasy about controlling and possessing someone who had never acknowledged his existence. The confession revealed a crime of opportunity that had been facilitated by careful planning and intimate knowledge of the victim's habits. Becker admitted to following Donna multiple times, learning her schedule, identifying the moments when she was most vulnerable. The pickup truck had served as both surveillance platform and weapon, allowing him to observe from distance before becoming the means through which he approached his victim on that October evening when all the variables aligned to create the opportunity he had been waiting for. As Becker continued his account, Sanders recognized the particular horror of crimes that combine predatory planning with spontaneous violence. The confession revealed not just what had happened to Donna Hughes, but how her disappearance had been the culmination of weeks of stalking behavior that had gone unnoticed by everyone who might have intervened before it was too late. The news of Luca Becker's arrest broke on a Tuesday morning in September, delivered through the kind of phone calls that travel through small communities with the speed and persistence of wildfire. Patricia Collins was opening Murphy's Diner when Sheriff's Department spokesperson Maria Rodriguez called to inform her that the man responsible for Donna Hughes's disappearance had been identified and charged. The words seemed to hang in the air of the empty restaurant, connecting a present moment with a tragedy that had occurred 26 years earlier in what felt like a different lifetime. Within hours, the revelation had reached every corner of the neighborhood where Donna had lived and died. Margaret Sullivan sat in her kitchen, the same room where she and Frank had discussed the strange pickup truck parked on their street corner all those years ago, trying to process the information that the man they'd observed had been not just a curious observer, but a predator preparing to strike. The weight of that realization, that she and Frank had been witnesses to the preliminary stages of a murder, brought tears that she hadn't experienced since Frank's funeral a decade earlier. The name Luca Becker initially meant nothing to most residents, but as news reports provided details about his employment at Patterson's Auto Repair, memories began to surface like photographs developing in chemical baths. James Patterson, now 73 and long retired from the automotive business, found himself fielding calls from reporters and neighbors who suddenly remembered the quiet mechanic who had worked on their cars and trucks during the early 1990s. The recollections were uniformly uncomfortable. A man who had seemed competent but unsettling, professional in his work, but inappropriate in his interactions with customers. Former Patterson's Auto Repair customers began sharing stories that they had never connected to Donna's disappearance, but now recognized as warning signs that had gone unheeded. Linda Gutierrez, Sophie's cousin, remembered bringing her car to the shop for brake work and feeling uncomfortable when Becker asked personal questions about her family and schedule. Several women recalled similar experiences, instances where Becker's conversation had wandered from automotive topics to inquiries that felt invasive and predatory in retrospect. The revelation that a killer had lived and worked among them for months after committing murder challenged the community's understanding of safety and familiarity. These were neighborhoods where people knew each other's routines, where unusual behavior was noticed and discussed, where the presence of strangers generated attention and scrutiny. The fact that Becker had maintained his facade of normalcy while carrying the knowledge of what he had done to Donna Hughes forced residents to question their ability to recognize danger when it wore familiar clothes and performed routine tasks. Local businesses that had operated during Becker's time in Tulsa County found themselves answering questions about a man who had been largely forgettable until his crimes made him unforgettable. The convenience store where he had occasionally bought cigarettes and coffee, the hardware store where he had purchased tools and supplies, the laundromat where he had washed his clothes, all became part of a map of ordinary places where a murderer had conducted the mundane business of daily life while hiding evidence of extraordinary violence. The psychological impact of learning that evil had worn such a mundane disguise affected different people in different ways. Some residents expressed anger at law enforcement agencies that had failed to identify Becker's pattern of behavior across jurisdictions, while others felt relief that the mystery that had haunted their community for more than 2 decades had finally been solved. Many struggled with complicated emotions that combined vindication with horror, satisfaction with the arrest, coupled with revulsion at the realization of how close they had all been to someone capable of such violence. Church services throughout the area that weekend included prayers for Donna's family and gratitude for the resolution of her case, but also acknowledgement of the unsettling truth that predators often hide in plain sight. conducting their lives among the people they victimize. The arrest provided answers to questions that had persisted for 26 years, but it also raised new concerns about the capacity for ordinary communities to protect themselves from the kind of calculated violence that Luca Becker had brought to their quiet corner of Tulsa County. Linda Hughes stood in the parking lot of the Tulsa County Courthouse on the morning of Luca Becker's arraignment, her hands trembling slightly as she held the manila folder that contained 26 years of her own investigation into her daughter's disappearance. At 73, she had imagined this moment countless times, but the reality felt both surreal and anticlimactic, a legal proceeding that would finally provide official acknowledgement of what had happened to Donna, but could never restore the life that had been stolen or the decades that had been spent wandering. Detective Sanders had called Linda the evening before the hearing to prepare her for what she would see and hear in the courtroom. Becker's appearance would be different from the man who had lived in their community during the 1990s, aged by nearly 2 decades of incarceration and marked by the institutional life that had shaped his daily existence since his conviction for another woman's murder. Sanders had warned Linda that the procedural nature of the arraignment would provide few of the emotional moments that families often expected from their first encounter with their loved one's killer. The courtroom filled slowly as the hearing time approached, a mixture of reporters, law enforcement personnel, and community members who had followed the case through its various phases of investigation and dormancy. Linda recognized faces from the vigils she had organized over the years, people who had maintained their connection to Donna's case through decades when official attention had faded. Sophie Gutierrez sat in the row behind Linda, now 51, and accompanied by teenage children who had grown up hearing stories about their mother's friend who had disappeared during what should have been a simple walk to visit. When Becker was escorted into the courtroom, Linda experienced a complex rush of emotions that she had not anticipated, despite years of preparation for this moment. The man responsible for her daughter's death appeared smaller and more fragile than she had imagined, his institutional jumpsuit and shackles making him seem like a broken person, rather than the monster she had envisioned during sleepless nights spent imagining Donna's final moments. The disconnect between her expectations and the reality of seeing Becker in person forced Linda to confront the uncomfortable truth that evil often presents itself in unremarkable packages. The formal charges were read with the bureaucratic efficiency that characterizes legal proceedings, each count delivered in language that reduced 26 years of grief and uncertainty to precise legal terminology. First-degree murder, kidnapping, evidence tampering, words that carried tremendous legal weight but seemed inadequate to describe the devastation that Becker's crimes had inflicted on everyone who had loved Donna Hughes. Linda listened to the charges while studying Becker's profile, looking for some sign of remorse or acknowledgement that might provide emotional closure to match the legal resolution. Becker's plea of not guilty, delivered in a voice barely audible beyond the first few rows of the courtroom, represented a final insult to the family and community that had spent decades seeking answers. Despite his detailed confession to Detective Sanders, despite the DNA evidence that had linked him conclusively to Donna's murder, Becker was choosing to force Linda and everyone else affected by his crimes to endure the additional trauma of a trial that would require them to relive the worst moments of their lives in public testimony. The impact of finally seeing her daughter's killer exceeded Linda's expectations for its emotional complexity. Relief at having answers mixed with renewed grief as she faced the reality that Donna's death had been both random and avoidable, the result of one man's predatory obsession with a young woman who had done nothing to attract his attention beyond existing in the same community where he had chosen to hunt. The knowledge that Donna's murder had been preceded by weeks of stalking and planning made her death seem both more personal and more senseless than Linda had imagined during the years when she had hoped it might have been a case of mistaken identity or random violence. As court officers escorted Becker back to his holding cell, Linda remained seated in the gallery, surrounded by people who had shared her vigil through decades of uncertainty, but who could not accompany her into the final phase of this journey toward justice. The legal process would continue for months, requiring her to testify about Donna's life and their relationship, to listen to evidence about how her daughter had died, to maintain her composure while facing the man who had destroyed both Donna's future and her own peace of mind. The resolution of Donna Hughes's case had provided answers that Linda had sought for 26 years, but it had also confirmed her worst fears about the violence and suffering that had marked her daughter's final moments. Justice would eventually be served through the legal system, but the decades of wondering and hoping could never be recovered, and the young woman who had left her apartment for a simple walk to visit a friend would remain forever 24, preserved in photographs and memories that had sustained her mother's faith that someday, somehow, the truth would emerge from the silence that had surrounded her disappearance. If this story has reminded you of the importance of never giving up on the search for truth, please subscribe to stay connected to the cases that matter most. Share your thoughts about how communities can better protect each other, because every story like Donna's represents not just one family's tragedy, but a reminder that vigilance and persistence can eventually bring even the darkest secrets into the light.